Hello. All right. So today we're going to be talking about the conquest of the New World by European powers, initially primarily the Spanish. And I actually think here it might be worth talking about what has kind of become a classic work that is one that's not usually thought of as a military history. And that is a book by an anthropologist, a guy named Jared Diamond, called Guns, Germs, and Steel. Again, this book is not conventionally seen as a military history, although it is oftentimes seen as kind of a foundational book in a new genre of history that is sometimes referred to as big history. Now, people's definition of big history might vary, but the goal of big history is generally to look at events over very, very significant timescales spanning, at the very minimum, multiple millennia. There are some big history courses that, I don't know if this is a great idea, but some big history courses actually start with the Big Bang. And then kind of, I guess, humans are just sort of the addendum at the end. But in many ways, Guns, Germs, and Steel is this kind of classic work of big history because it tries to think about an immediate military problem and then try to explain it looking at differences in societal development over very long periods. So the immediate problem that Jared Diamond, who again was not trained as a historian, rather, he was an anthropologist and biologist, evolutionary biologist. But he wanted to explain why, when a small number of Spanish conquistadors arrive in the New World, why are they able to easily, it seems, almost effortlessly, overthrow much larger political entities. In particular, for him at least, his question is why are roughly 160 Spanish conquistadors under Pizarro able to overthrow the entire Incan Empire, which is a relatively new empire, but is able to mobilize resources on a pretty significant scale. And indeed, the maybe battle is too kind of word, the ambush that overthrows the Incan Empire in 1532 sees 160 conquistadors kill several thousand lightly armed Incan bodyguards, allowing them to capture the Incan emperor and effectively overthrow the Incan Empire in a single coup. Likewise, and this had happened a few years earlier, in 1521, Hernan Cortez had successfully conquered the entire Aztec Empire, a large political configuration in central Mexico, also capable of mobilizing probably thousands of armed warriors. And he's able to do this with conquistadors who probably number at most around 1,000. So his question was, why are these tiny numbers of, at times very poorly supplied, frequently wretchedly led conquistadors, how are they able to overthrow societies that are much, much larger? Now, in some ways, the immediate answer that he had, which is the title of the book, is less interesting. It's Guns, Germs, and Steel. And we might add maybe in parentheses, and horses. So obviously the first one, guns, firearms technologies do not exist in the New World. And while they're actually still relatively primitive, remember the kind of rifles that we've been talking about, arquebuses and eventually muskets, have only been around by the time we get to these battles for maybe 50 years, only a couple generations. And they're still pretty primitive, mostly initially matchlock guns. The Europeans don't even have that many of them. Pizarro, when he defeats the Inca and captures the Incan Emperor Atahualpa, has like 12 guns, 12 muskets, and 4 cannon. He doesn't have that many, but that being said, these are such new and startling bits of technology that they certainly give the Europeans an extraordinary advantage and are a potent force multiplier. a handful of soldiers firing guns, even if they ultimately can't kill that many people because they're still only shooting a bullet at a time, can nonetheless be a very terrifying presence to people who've never seen guns before. So guns was the first technological factor. Then he talked about germs, and this, of course, is quite critical because in some ways the mass genocidal death that hits Native American peoples starting in the late 15th century and really hitting hard starting in the 16th century is disease. It's diseases like particularly smallpox, all of these European diseases, typhoid fever, stuff that's been killing Europeans for generations, causes a whole series of virgin soil epidemics. And this, in many instances, weakens native societies even before they encounter European colonists and conquistadors who, again, by and large, are small in numbers, wretchedly led, poorly supplied, and yet they're hitting societies that have been just devastated, not even decimated, almost obliterated by virgin soil epidemics. Because when a population, I guess we're kind of learning this now, but these are diseases that are very, very lethal, and yet they're hitting a population that has no built-in immunity, whereas European populations do. So we have the guns, the technology, we have germs, which nonetheless, the nature of those germs is the development of kind of the long-term divergent epidemiological backgrounds of both societies, guns, germs, and then steel. Simply the fact that at best, Native American societies were just entering the Copper Age. There is some copper working technology that's going on in South America. By and large, they're still in the Stone Age, though. And of course, they're doing quite extraordinary and incredible things with stone. But metallurgy is also going to be an extraordinary military advantage that Europeans have, including in some of these limited number of engagements where they successfully overthrow much larger Aztec or Incan armies. That is one European wearing armor, even if he doesn't have a gun, because they don't have that many guns, but can still strike, his armor can protect him from arrows or even from attacks with stone weapons, and then his own steel weaponry is going to be much more lethal as he goes on the offense. And of course, I say that guns, germs, and steel. We might also say, and horses. The fact that the Inca do use llamas as pack animals, but these are societies that, by and large, don't have, again, beyond say alpacas and llamas in a limited number, don't have either domesticated beasts or burdens, and aren't able to use animals as a war platform. And again, this is a very strong force multiplier, which we see, for example, when Pizarro and his small force attack the Inca. One Spaniard on a horse, he has about actually 60 cavalry, but a small squadron of 60 cavalry, again, can prove devastating in that the horse gives them the advantage of the fighting platform, of being able to strike down, of the intimidation factor. And this is something that, again, American societies in both North and South America just don't have any real experience with. And of course, that's particularly deadly when combined with not just the horse, but the steel armor and steel weapons. So these are all things that we might pretty easily say, well, yes, that's going to give any force that has that an extraordinary advantage compared to the society that doesn't have that. But the deeper question that Jared Diamond wanted to ask was, well, why do the Europeans have the guns and the germs and the steel and the horses when these pretty sophisticated imperial societies, the Aztecs and the Inca, don't? Why was technological? Why were technological developments more advanced in Europe than they were in the Americas? I mean, and he even poses this sort of provocative question. Why is it a bunch of Spanish conquistadors arrive in South America or Mexico and overthrow the Aztecs and Inca? Why don't the Aztecs, aren't they sending an expedition to Spain to overthrow the King of Spain? Now, for Diamond, the answer really to all of these questions lay in the timing of the development of agriculture. And here, this is where the big history comes in. He's trying to answer initially a kind of narrow military history question. Why are the conquistadors winning against what is extraordinary numerical odds? And his basic answer is, well, immediately they've got guns, germs, and steel. But the reason that Europeans developed guns, germs, and steel is that agriculture, of all the places agriculture has developed independently, develops first in Western Eurasia, what's now Mesopotamia. And that, of course, there is agriculture in Mexico, where maize, corn predominates. There's agriculture in South America, where potatoes are the primary crop. And indeed, these really innovative crops go back in the so-called Columbian Exchange and start getting planted all over Europe, and even come to predominate in Europe. But, as Diamond notes, agriculture happens much earlier in Europe. And again, this is kind of, just a fluke, in that the kinds of grasses that are easiest to domesticate happen to be very common in the Fertile Crescent. He even notes that once they're domesticated, to actually have the agricultural technology transmitted, it helps to have a continent like Eurasia that has a horizontal axis, because for the view who's a gardener, what you can grow kind of depends on your latitude. So if once you say perfect something like wheat, it can quickly go across the horizontal axis of Eurasia, whereas this becomes a little harder when you have the Americas, which are on a vertical axis. That means a crop that it develops in one location may not immediately be effective if you start trying to plant it at a higher and higher latitude. And this may ultimately slow the rate at which the new agricultural technologies transmit. So again, these are kind of flukes. The first grain there's just a lot of good grain to domesticate in Mesopotamia. The axis of which agriculture can spread sort of favors people who happen to live across Eurasia. But that head start, which is again kind of random, is nonetheless critical for Diamond. For one thing, agriculture develops alongside with pastoralism. As Europeans, and again, really, it's not just Europeans, but it's really the kind of broader ecosystem of Eurasia and Africa. But as those domesticated animals start being used by developing, evolving agrarian societies, they also make those societies sick. I mean, as we're kind of learning with coronavirus, when you're in close contact with animals, you get sick from your animals. But you're more likely to get sick from those animals if you're domesticating them and using them as beasts of burden, which people are doing in Eurasia, and again, by Eurasia, I really actually kind of mean Eurasia, North Africa, and across the Eurasian continent. But this also means that those populations start developing diseases. And actually, as we've seen, these diseases can be grievous and have huge effects. The plague in Athens, the plague that Marcus Aurelius experiences that seems to actually temporarily weaken the Roman Empire, the plague of Justinian. These are really terrible things, but there is a tiny side effect that sort of Pizarro and Cortez and those conquistadors benefit from, is that they've been, because of the ongoing transmission from domesticated animals, there are many more germs that the Europeans have. And they, therefore, inadvertently bring powerful biological weapons that are actually the product of the last 10,000 years of Eurasian pastoralism. So that's where we get the germs. And ultimately, Diamond basically says, look, technological growth is kind of an exponential curve. You spend a long time down here, but the longer you spend down here, the more likely you are to kind of have your breakaway. And in some ways, if we think about kind of what we'll call Western technology, as Tonio Andrade is I think, demonstrated quite nicely in his book, there are some big breakaways that are taking place in China too, which of course in some ways it's the same, there's some reasons why there's actually big sophisticated societies on both sides of the Eurasian continent, I think, by this kind of big picture view. But suffice to say, Europeans spend a lot of time here developing agriculture, developing pastoralism, minor improvements, a little, and that they're starting to move up the curve, though, by the time we get to the 15th century. And of course, in some ways, all of the technological things we've been talking about, whether it's new types of ships, new types of navigation, gunpowder technology, even if some of it's borrowed from the East, also represents moving up the curve. And of course, because you need you need technologies to develop new technologies. The more technology that you have, the faster you start on the uptake. Of course, in some ways, you've probably experienced that even just thinking about improvements in consumer electronics over the past 10 years. They keep getting better and better, in part because we are sort of privileged to be on sort of this part of the exponential curve for technological development. So that's why the Europeans have better metallurgy. That's why they have guns. That's why they have ships that can sail the Atlantic. It all really matters. You start agriculture here, and then you start getting those things here, roughly 9,000 years later. So that was Diamond's real attempt to explain how, again, it's things that are kind of flukes. Do you happen to live in an area that has obvious things to domesticate? At what point do societies start to domesticate crops? At what point do societies start to domesticate animals? And of course, agriculture and pastoralism they interface quite a bit. And the fact that the Europeans are starting around 10,000 years ago, whereas maize is probably being domesticated in central Mexico around 5,000 years ago, and even potatoes somewhat later, that just gives people living in Western Eurasia a tremendous head start, which is why by the early 16th century, they're able to send out, admittedly, small, wretchedly led, poorly supplied expeditions. And yet those small, wretchedly led, poorly supplied expeditions are nonetheless able to conquer huge amounts of territory in a shockingly small time. And of course, in the process, profoundly alter not just Western European history, but also the history of the entire globe. So one thing we'll actually consider when we talk next time is at what point are we sort of at a turning point or inflection point as we talk about the cultural and social history? Or maybe a question as we get close to the end is, when should this course end? At what point are we in a world of modernity that should be the subject of this course's sequel? So we'll talk soon.